Yeah, it's recording now. All right. So, uh, you can see my first slide.
We can see your Teams window right now on the first slide.
Okay, I have switched. It should appear now any moment. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it should. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, as we discussed last time, today's class is going to be a very general introduction to the city of Mumbai and some of the important socio-political events that have shaped the city. It's The purpose of this presentation is to give you a general sense of the city and its geography, its demography, its political economy, and so on. It's not a very detailed presentation on all the various aspects of the city, but it is in the spirit of an introductory uh, lecture. What the broader purpose of presenting the method of presentation of this that I'm going to be doing today is more like is to highlight the fact that the city is actually an outcome of various contradictory processes. Hmm? We generally like to think, and architects and planners and so on like to think that the city is an outcome of either technical problems that technocrats solve, or interventions of designers and visionaries and architects and so on. But what we intend to do through this course and in this class also is to highlight how the way in which planners, technocrats, architects, the technical intelligentsia, so called, of the city, have a role, but they have a role which is not so straightforward. There have been plans made for the city, but those plans have not simply been um, implemented or executed just as they were planned. Similarly, there were also plans that were not made for the city where they should have been made, right? So there are so when we talk about planning, generally, the notion is that so if you ask somebody, is Mumbai planned? And generally, the answer that you'll get, especially amongst middle class groups, will be no, the city suffers because it is not planned, right? However, if you will, I mean, you will notice at the end of this presentation that the city has been planned and it has been incessantly planned. But it has been planned selectively. It has also been planned in certain very specific ways, and that those plans have been at times fiercely contested and often overturned as well, right? So this is broadly the overarching argument of the presentation, but we'll go through it historically a little bit, and you will see um, how this city came about to be what it is today, right? Okay, so this is a very simple map of the city. The black outline that you can see is actually the current administrative boundary of Greater Mumbai, right? So that's a purely administrative line, and as you can see, it's not a geographical line. It only roughly approximates the physical outlines of the city, but the gray patches that you see, the islands, is what Bombay is known for. It is, I don't know how many times you've heard the cliche that Bombay actually was seven islands. Whoever um, came up with this notion had a very South Bombay centric view, because there were seven islands in South Bombay, yes. But if you look at the city at a regional scale, you realize that there were many, many islands, and not just seven. And many of these islands eventually got interlinked. But it's important to remember that the spaces between those islands were not the deep ocean, right? They were all what is called wetlands, marshlands, swamps, and so on, which were eventually filled over time either through formal projects, state or private interventions, or through the various acts of people filling up land to make habitable space and so on. So yeah, the first slide actually is in a way something to illustrate that the myth of the seven islands is what it is. It's a myth, and if you want to talk about islands in Bombay, you should probably talk about many more islands. Um, you know that the city Bombay, obviously, and before it was Bombay, it was Bombia, or there were various other names. Was actually a pre-agrarian landscape, and there were many different settlements around in the various islands of the city, and those were mainly agrarian, settlements which were based on what we call today primary activities which are agrarian or extractive. So for instance, fishing, where you tap a resource, um, and these settlements were uh, existed before the Portuguese eventually came and set up a base here. And the first base was what is today called fort, and this is actually an image from the early from the, I think, the mid 1700s, where you can see the fort of the city, and there is the fort wall, the bastions. Hmm? The Bombay Green is this kind of central space, which was earlier a place where all the cotton was stocked here, which was imported. Now, Bombay had a very important role as a colonial port town. And in the colonial process, the city of Bombay actually emerged as a port in order to extract raw materials from the city, from India, which was later shipped to the colonies. Right. So this was and the Bombay harbor was a very conducive natural harbor for shipping, and therefore it became an important port for the colonial authorities at that time. Now, if so what happened was the fort obviously was an important beginning for the city. However, if you looked at the fort and the way it was organized, I mean, even today, if you go to fort, you will see that there are two different kinds of fabrics in the fort. The northern part of the fort is more bazaar-like, whereas the southern part of the fort is more formal and institutional. And that kind of approximated the demography of the fort at that time. So in the northern parts of the fort were where the indigenous communities lived, which is basically natives, Indians settled there. Mostly the traders and the wealthy traders, Parsis, Boras, and so on. Whereas the southern part of the fort was inhabited by the British, and there was this kind of a racial divide between the fort, but it wasn't as rigid and hard lined as we got to see later. Now, what happened is in 1805 there was a big fire in the northern fort, which became a pretext for the British to move out many of the Indians who lived there into other parts of the city. So we'll come to that later. Okay, now one of the problems for the colonial administration at that time was that Bombay was only the port. There was nothing much beyond it other than the port and those agrarian settlements that were scattered around the city. And they wanted, it was realized that Bombay has the potential of being an important trading post, but it didn't really have a population. And there was another port in the western flank of India, which was Surat, which was quite a strong competitor to Bombay itself. So the thinking at that time was that Bombay must be made attractive for people to come and settle here. So what the colonial authorities did at that point was they offered extremely attractive land terms to traders from various parts of the country to come and settle in what today we call the inner city. At that time, it was called the native town, which you can see here as the large dark gray patch. Which was basically, the attractive land terms were that there were almost no regulations on how people wanted to develop those lands. and they were also offered very few restrictions on trade and so on. So a lot of people eventually natives migrated to Bombay and set up shops here, set up their businesses here, and the fabric of the native town in a way reflected those both the absence of land regulations, but also the kind of occupations that people practiced here. So what would happen is that there were earlier agrarian plots of land where somebody would set up a small house, mostly a road front house, and there would be a shop below and a house above. And slowly over time, as more and more people migrated, there was a demand for housing. So what these landowners would do is they would expand the house, and incrementally these houses started growing to an extent that they would occupy the entire footprint of the plot, but they would also start going higher. And at that time, since you didn't have elevator technologies and so on, there would be a limit to how high these houses could go. So you would get up to ground plus three, ground plus four, at the most ground plus five houses. At that time, mainly ground plus three or ground plus four houses. And that is how the fabric of the built form of the inner city emerged. Now, you should also remember that this is the pre-automobile urban form, and therefore you don't see any broad avenues, or you don't see very large roads. Most people at that time commuted by walk or by animal driven transport. And so human power was the main source of transportation, was the main human and animal power was the main form of transportation technology, and the urban form kind of reflected that as well. So you get a certain kind of urban fabric, very dense, mostly narrow pedestrian lanes, and usually fairly walkable. So this fort and native town was the extent really of the city at that time. Now, what also happens is, if you look at this closely, this fabric, as I mentioned, that each of these strips of land that you see were further subdivided, and that's how you have those buildings emerge, which were fairly close to each other, and so on. Now, it's important to remember that, we tend to kind of often romanticize these vernacular forms of settlement growth, but you have to also remember that these were not simply urban form that emerged as a result of vibrant livelihood practices. There were in fact a lot of what is called today land speculation happening. So landlords who owned these plots of land would build, and they would build housing which were literally one room tenements, maybe even smaller. Today, what we understand as a room is a certain size, but you would have rooms which were very, very small. And because the landlord would want to get in as many tenants as possible on these plots, they would really overbuild to an extent where there would be hardly any space between neighboring buildings, and the entire plots would be occupied. So there would be very little space around the buildings that would be open, and so on. And these created extremely dense and very poorly very poor conditions of housing. And in fact, at that time, there were numerous reports of inspections by the authorities on the housing conditions, and those were painted a very poor picture of what was going on at that time. So these practices, even though it wasn't, and you should also remember that these landlords were Indians, right? They were not British landlords, they were Indian landlords who were really benefiting from the kind of congestion in these neighborhoods as well. So now you also notice, if you go back, that there are two brown patches here. One is the fort, which is the dense settlement in the south, sorry. And then you have the northern native town, which is the bazaar areas of the city. And there is a space in between, right? That space was at that time called the Esplanade. Now, the Esplanade was created as a military device, because there was a fort, and the fort had fort walls. The Esplanade is a kind of a extension of the fort walls. It's basically a clear area where if you see an enemy approaching, you can sight them easily, and then you can also attack them, right? So the Esplanade was a military device, because at that time there were various kinds of wars between the Marathas and the British and so on. Later on, obviously, this kind of warfare was outdated, and the walls were pulled down, and this Esplanade area was later converted into, into largely an amenity and institutional core. So a lot of these institutions that you see in South Bombay are laid out in this esplanade, where I mean, even the Victoria Terminus, for instance, came up here. The Maidans of South Bombay came up here. A lot of the institutions, JJ School of Art and others, came up there in the Esplanade. All right. So yeah, this is the Esplanade, and the dotted line is the fort wall, which was earlier the fort wall, which was later pulled down, and then it was other things were built there. All right. So now, as I mentioned, in the native town, especially because of the conditions of housing that emerged in the native town, and the kind of density of people living there, and the fact that the colonial authorities paid a lot of attention to the sanitary needs of the soldiers and the British officials who lived in Colaba and the southern parts of Fort. And so those were very well serviced. There were sewer lines, and there were all kinds of facilities there. But the native town was completely neglected. And now the reason for this was very simple. For the colonial authorities, this neglect was justified by saying that this is how the Indians like to live. And this is the kind of Orientalist policy that was very much a part of colonial administration at that time all over India. The idea that we don't need to worry about things like sanitation in native settlements, because the Indians live in this manner. The colonial neglect was justified as a kind of an acceptance of the native habits, dirty native habits of living in a certain manner. Obviously, that was completely baseless. The idea was that the British had no interest in caring for the welfare of the Indians who lived in the native town. And also, it's important to remember that the Esplanade, which was a military measure, was also became a kind of a sanitary measure, because by through this Esplanade you could create a distance between the native settlements and the British settlements. And if you see other colonial cities in India, you will find that there is some or the other form of separation. It might be a railway line, it might be a major road, it might be a Maidan. In Pondicherry, it's a canal, and so on. So these were ways in which, and especially after 1857, when the British started fearing native rebellions, they started creating these devices, these urban devices, to separate themselves from the colonial population. So, what happened as a result of this neglect of sanitation in the native town, and the kind of the exploitative and speculation that was happening there by the landlords, the conditions became so poor that they became conducive for the spread of disease. And in 1896, you must probably already know that there was a extremely deadly plague that struck the city of Bombay, which actually resulted in the fleeing of almost one third of the population from the city. That's the only time, I think, in the history of the city where there's a negative population growth that decade, because a lot of people perished due to the plague, and many fled the city in fear and panic. And something very interesting happened at that time. Because of that, you know, the now the colonial enterprises at that time, colonial and Indian businesses. So at this point in 1896, Bombay is already an industrial city. Cotton mills have come up in various places around the city, and these mills depend on the labor of the native population, obviously. And because of the plague and lots of people fleeing the city, what happened was that there was an economic crisis. Now, the colonial authorities so far could neglect the health and sanitation needs of the, of the working classes of Bombay. But when the plague struck, they realized that if they neglect the sanitary conditions of the city's inhabitants, it is eventually going to hurt them commercially, because because labor will not stay in the city or will either perish, and this will be bad for business. So when for the first time they realized the interconnection between the city's social policy, which is things like health and sanitation and so on, and the city's economic health, in terms of business and so on, they realized that they have to do something about the deteriorating living conditions. And that is when, in 1898, after the 2 years after the plague struck the city, the Bombay Improvement Trust was set up. The Improvement Trust actually was set up as a colonial institution. It was represented by the municipal government of Bombay, the provincial government of Bombay, the province of Bombay, which today we call it Maharashtra, but at that time it was Bombay province. So the state government and the municipal government had a representation in the Bombay Improvement Trust, but more importantly were represented the mill owners of Bombay and the big traders of Bombay, right? So all of these interests were represented in the Bombay Improvement Trust. And the idea was that the improvement trust was to carry out improvement works in the city, which would, which would address the poor sanitation and living conditions of the working classes of Bombay, right? So the Bombay Improvement Trust, obviously, as a colonial organ which was completely unaccountable to the general population of the city, though it was accountable to the city's elite, the industrial and commercial elite, carried out these improvement works in an extremely violent and arbitrary manner. So there were streets that were widened, and these widened streets were meant to actually bring in sea breezes into the dense urban fabric of the city, because the belief was that the disease was spread due to miasmas in the air rather than rather than bacteria, which was odd because in Britain the British knew that diseases are spread by germs and not by air. But when they came to the colonies, they forgot that it was actually germs. But in any case, so there were these street widening projects that were taken up. A lot of houses were demolished. And in what ended up happening was that, in fact, the Bombay Improvement Trust ended up demolishing more houses than it ever built, which worsened the housing crisis in the city. But what they also, I mean, in the later part of the Bombay Improvement Trust's work, which was after 1910, 1911, they started focusing more on suburban schemes, so these green patches that you see in the north near Worli and near Dadar, which were basically the suburban colonial suburbs that were built by the Bombay Improvement Trust on what they call sanitary lines. These were very poor, kind of replicas of the garden city idea, where the idea was that a house should be surrounded by a garden, and the neighborhood should have lots of open spaces within it. And these streets were actually designed. If you see on the left hand side, there are some street sections which are shown. So the street sections were also fairly generous and wide streets. You must remember that at this point, very few people in the city drove cars or had motorized vehicles. But yet the streets were designed for the automobile almost, even though there was a tram line in the middle on the major roads. But there was a certain kind of suburban imagination for what a sanitary city would look like, which was implemented by the Bombay Improvement Trust at that time. Obviously, these lands were agrarian lands, which were assembled by buying them from the agricultural landholders. And though then So this is called the town planning scheme. Basically, the way it works is, if you are an agricultural landholder, the land will be taken from you, and similarly the land will be taken from all the neighboring agricultural plots, and they will be planned in the sense that streets will be laid out on them and so on, and these plots in a reduced proportion will be given back to you. But the idea is that even though there is a reduction in the land area, because as a result of these infrastructure improvements, there is an increase in the land value. So what you lose in land area, you make up for land value. In fact, you make up much more. Now the land becomes urbanized and it becomes developable, and you can build housing and other commercial establishments and so on. So the town planning scheme was thought of as a kind of a win-win situation for the landlords and for the city as a whole. So this was the BIT's interventions at that time. Now, this table actually shows the population growth in the city of Bombay from the 1780s to 2011. That's when we have the latest census. The 2021 census has not yet come. So as you can see, so there are quite a few columns here, and if you are not used to seeing tables, if you notice in the third column, the first column is year, the second column is island city, and the third column is the growth rate. If you look at the growth rate, there are only two times where there is a negative growth rate in the population, three times actually, where there's a negative growth rate in the population of the island city, and that is in 1901, 1951, and 2011. Okay, but if you look at the island city population, the second column, there is only once when there is a reduction in the absolute population from 821,000 to 775,000, and that's the result of the plague mainly, right? Okay, so you can also see towards the right, you see the suburban populations. That's the fourth column. And you can see after a certain point that the suburbs are growing at a much, much rapid rate than the island city itself. And we'll come to why that is happening. That is happening mostly post-independence as a result of the influx of migrants from all over the country and from other parts of Maharashtra. And the way in which the suburbs developed is a kind of a result of the post-independence migrations in the city. All right, so this is a map of Bombay at the end of the 20th century. So let's say early 1900s. This is what Bombay looked like, right? So mostly the island city is almost entirely inhabited. You can see the bright yellow to the left is all the middle and upper class residential areas. The ochre color in the middle is what you see as mixed used low income and middle income housing. The purple that you see there in the middle is the industry, right? That's where all the cotton textile mills were. And to the right, the dark purple color that you see, those were the port developments, which is very closely linked to industry, right? You have cotton coming in, going to the industries, and then the finished products being shipped out of the port. So you see a direct connection between the port and the industrial areas of the city. And as you notice in the early part that the in this map that the suburban areas are largely uninhabited except for some yellow patches that you see scattered around, which were the urban villages, or at that time just villages in the suburbs, right? Which but you will see as later as the city grew to engulf all of these areas. So yeah, these were the textile mills of Bombay. And I don't know how much of this history you know, but the textile mills, there were um, textile mills which were owned by private owners. There were also textile mills that were publicly owned, and those ones which were publicly owned became publicly owned after independence, right? But there were a lot of private textile mills as well. Now, what happened is in the anyway, the land story of the textile mills. We'll explain to you when we do some readings on the mills. We don't want to get into too many details right now because otherwise this will go on forever. You can spend a week on this. All right. So you should also remember that the extent of Bombay was changed over time. So the original limit of Bombay was till Siam, right? That's why it's called the island city. Later in 1950s, immediately after independence, the boundary of Greater Mumbai was pushed till what is today, Andheri, and probably I think you know maybe Borivali, Dahisar, and then later in 1957 it was pushed again to what we know today. Now, this map is a mistake. It's wrong. All right. We deliberately put it here to show that it's a mistake. The 65 boundary that is being shown here is not actually the Greater Bombay boundary. The 57 boundary is the actual current boundary of it. Even that's a very sketchy approximate boundary. But the boundary was extended up to take in, to reach all the way up to Dhaisar on one side and um, Thana, up to Thana on the other side. All right. In the 60s, what started happening? So now this is interesting. The the pattern of growth in Greater Bombay was, as one historian called it, there was a specific pattern which was what he called the growth overspill annexation model, which is basically that these limits of Greater Bombay were deliberately kept, uh, you know, um, deliberately not extended earlier. And and the reason for that is very simple. When you are within the boundary of a municipal corporation, any development activity that happens is regulated under the municipal corporation by under the jurisdiction of the municipal authority. When you have some activity happening outside these boundaries, the municipal authority has no jurisdiction there, right? So what would happen is that even though the extent of Bombay in original extent was still Siam, there were already developments happening in Bandra and other places outside this boundary. Then later, when these boundaries were extended, all that had happened, what you would call irregular or unauthorized developments, was simply regularized because after the boundary was extended. And this went on 2 or 3 times, right? And so the city grew in a certain pattern, in a north-south pattern. And you know that there are these two railway lines which go the western and the eastern, which kind of fork at some point and after the other, and you see that the city has grown around these railway lines in this kind of a speculative manner, and each time there was overspill beyond the municipal boundaries, the municipal extent would be extended, and these developments were regularized. So there was a convenient model of speculating in areas which were not administered by any formal authority, right? So at some point in the 50s and 60s, the city's landowners and the elites, the industrial elite, realized that there is a limit to how much you can grow in this manner, in this north-south speculative manner, you know. And soon there was talk of trying to connect the island city to the mainland so that the city could grow on the mainland rather than in this north-south linear direction. And so the Navi Mumbai plan was made. Now the story that we have heard as architects about the New Bombay Plan was because Charles Correa was involved and Shirish Patel was involved, and these are known to be very kind of progressive figures. And honestly, that their plan was not very bad, but the motivation for that plan was really that the city's big businesses wanted to now start looking at the mainland for more lucrative opportunities for land speculation and development and so on. Um, and so the New Bombay Plan, that was the genesis, and the plan was made by these Shirish Patel, Charles Correa, and Praveena Mehta. And the plan was good. It had one important proposal, which was that the Mantralay be shifted to Navi Mumbai. Now, why would that be? Very simply, because if the headquarters of the government of Maharashtra moved, a lot of the public sector jobs and the private sector jobs that rely on the proximity to these headquarters will also move. And when that happens, because these jobs move to the mainland, a lot of the movement patterns in the city will also shift, and then there will be a very good reason for people to settle near these new headquarters rather than settling in trying to find homes in the island city, and therefore the increased demand kind of raises house and property prices even more and so on. So it was An important proposal which was obviously never implemented, and therefore Navi Mumbai, when it was built, became more as a kind of a suburban dormitory suburb kind of a place, even though there was industry there. But the key element of the Navi Mumbai plan was not implemented, right? Okay, so now, as you also know, perhaps maybe sketchily, but you know that the city also got deindustrialized at a point. Deindustrialized means that the extent of industrial occupations declined in Bombay, and that is an important shift in the city's political economy. You can see in these tables here that in 1961 there were 4,000 factories, approximately 4,000 factories in island city of Bombay, and there were 505,000 workers. Okay, these are formal sector workers. These are not workers who depend on the formal industry. They are the ones who are working in the mills. And if you look at the CAGR, which actually expands to compound annual growth rate, the annual growth rate of factories and workers, you see that both are positive figures: 3.5% growth in factories and 1.61% growth in workers. In 71, you see an increase in the number of factories. In 81, you see an increase in the number of factories and the workers, right? And then something happens after 81, between 81 and 91, the number of factories almost stagnates. It's almost the same. But the number of workers declines, minus 2.95. And this is a very important moment in the history of the city where actually industrial employment plummeted. And the reason for this, there are many reasons. There are large and small reasons, but to give you just a very rough background, the industries in Bombay, the mills of Bombay, as they're called, were based on a model, an economic model that was chosen by the Indian state post independence, which is called the import substitution industry model, which basically means that the local industrial producers produce not for foreign markets, but they produce for local markets. And the foreign markets were actually, the import of foreign goods was restricted through tariffs and all kinds of. Um, um, One sec. Sorry. Um, the tariffs and uh, would prevent foreign goods from entering the country, and therefore the local industry had no incentive really to improve its technology. Whatever they produced, that would be they had an assured market in the country, and so the mills in Bombay were benefited from these protectionist policies of the state, and therefore they did not upgrade themselves at all. Right now, in the 80s, what started happening is that the mill owners started realizing that the land value of the mills, that land value of the areas of the lands on which their mills sit, um, gives them a more possibility of profiteering than by manufacturing and selling goods. Right. So when that happens, the mill owners had a very strong incentive to shut down industry in Greater Mumbai and move to real estate. Now, there was one thing that was preventing that from happening, and that was what we call development planning and zoning, because all of these areas were zoned as industrial use only, and therefore, as long as that zoning existed, the mill owners could not um, convert those lands into commercial or residential property. And so obviously there was a lot of pressure on the state to remove that zoning, and all of that happened. And we'll, again, when we study the mill land story, we'll get into this in detail. But so there was already that happening in the background. Meanwhile, because of this neglect of industry, the workers were also not getting their dues. There was severe problems in working conditions and so on. And so in 1981, between 81 and 83, there was a very, very big strike, Millworker Strike in Bombay, which actually led to the defeat of the unions, because many of these factories were eventually shut down, and lots of tens of thousands of people lost their jobs. Many of them did not get any kind of compensation whatsoever. And this meant that the people who were formerly employed in the mills had to look for other occupations, and mainly in the informal sector. So if you look at the table below, the sectoral composition, you will see that the percentage of, so the primary, secondary, and tertiary industry. The primary is mainly extractive industries, quarrying, fishing, farming, and so on. The secondary is manufacturing, and tertiary is what we call services, hotels, banking, and so on, right? So the in 93, 94, manufacturing was about 39% of the city's GDP, whereas in 2009, 2010, it dropped to 25%. And look at the share of the tertiary sector, which was 60% in 93, 94, which has gone to 74% in 2009, 2010. So manufacturing still exists in the city, but its share has been greatly reduced. And Mumbai has moved more and more towards a service sector economy. And this is a very important graph, actually, which looks at, so there are three colors here. The blue bar is the metropolitan core, which is what is called the Greater Mumbai. The suburban towns are the towns in the MMR region, the small towns in the MMR region, and the green bar is the suburban villages, so the non-urban areas in the MMR, if you leave out Greater Mumbai. And if you see, manufacturing in the metropolitan core is negative, right? This is between 98 and 2005. So manufacturing is negative. Suburban villages manufacturing is going up, which means that a lot of these industries which are being shut down in Greater Mumbai are moving to the non-urban areas in MMR, right? The same thing is happening in fast-growing export manufacturing. A similar thing is happening in low and medium tech manufacturing, though the growth in the suburbs is much less. And then high tech manufacturing, again a decline in Greater Mumbai, but a growth in the suburban villages. But look at real estate; it's growing everywhere, right? So what is the main economy of the city today? It's mainly real estate. And actually, you should extend that to there's a sector called finance, investment, industry, finance, and real estate, which is what mainly the investments in the city are, and where the main economic growth in the city is. So, which means that what you see around you happening is largely driven by the interests of real estate. Okay, so this is Mumbai as it looked in the 21st century, the early 2000s. And as you can see, if you compare it with the first diagram, the large patch of purple in the island city is now fragmented. Now only the public sector mills still exist. All the private sector mills have gone. You have the western suburb, the western coast is still the middle and upper class residential. The portlands are there, but the portlands are also now going to be commercialized very soon. And you see the rest of the kind of growth pattern in the suburbs as well. So yeah, now what what kind of major changes are going on in the city? So I mean, there's a lot of talk since the 90s, since liberalization in Bombay, as to what should be the future of the city. This is already after the mills have been shut, and big business groups are talking about reconfiguring Bombay as a city for finance and high tech industry, right? So this is a diagram from the 2001 report by CRISIL. CRISIL is the full form is Credit Ratings and I Indicator something something limited. Basically, CRISIL is a ratings agency. So in big business terminology, ratings industries are very important, because basically what they do is they tell you how credit worthy an organization is. and therefore what it's how much it can draw, how much it can, how much can the investors who want to invest in a particular business, how much they can trust that business. So the credit ratings are very important. So these credit agencies not only rate firms and businesses, they also rate cities, right? So CRISIL was made this proposal in 2001 for making Mumbai a financial service center, international financial center. And they proposed that there be four of these large new business districts set up. There is one already in Nariman Point. There should be one set up in Bandakula complex, which was already set up at that time, and then one in Andheri and one back office in Belapur. And then these be connected with high speed infrastructure, network, roads mainly, highways, freeways, and so on. Now notice that this is CRISIL's map of Mumbai, and that tells you how much they understand the geography of Mumbai. The airport is somewhere in the, I don't know, in Mankhurd or somewhere. The mill land is shown with an arrow which indicates, I don't know where, probably a Sivri or something. So, I mean, obviously, they have probably not even looked at a map of Bombay while preparing this. But basically, this is the kind of ideas that were floating around at that time. And there was a very important and highly cited report prepared by McKinsey. McKinsey is a global management consultancy firm, notorious for the kind of advice that they have given to firms all over the world. In fact, Enron scandal was to a large extent McKinsey's doing. So that's, but they also, I mean, but if when somebody gets recommendations from McKinsey, it is considered to be expert opinion. So McKinsey prepared a short, I think about a 20-page, almost a brochure as to how to make Mumbai an international financial center, world-class city, and all of that jargon. And as you can see here, this was a proposal which was made by McKinsey, which is basically, again, those business districts scattered around Bandakurla, Nariman Point, JNPT, Belapur, Vashi. And the blue line is basically ring roads, freeways, which were connecting all of these freeways, right? And the railways, in a ring rail, is actually metros. So a lot of these infrastructure projects that you see coming up in Bombay today have their origins in these sketchy imaginations of these big business consultancy groups in the 90s. Um, so this was another very important document, which is um, not a not a plan for not a plan prepared by the government, but this was a concept plan that was made in 2009 and 9 by, which was commissioned by MMRDA to a Singapore planning firm called Surbana. Now, Surbana is well known for preparing these master plans for greenfield cities in China and the Middle East and so on. So they work with autocracies really and create these absolutely clean slate imaginations for the city. The Surbana was handed over this commission to make a concept plan for Mumbai. What did they do? One second, let me try to find a slide. Yeah, here it is. So this was Surbana's great plan for Bombay, and all of these nicely shaped patches that you see are actually islands, believe it or not, which they proposed in the Mahim Creek, in the Thana Creek. The idea was that Mumbai was a city of 7 islands, so why can't we make it again a city of islands, and then we'll have these beautiful freeways which will link them all up, and and why we can actually create these thematic districts. So there will be a recreational district. Each of these patches is a district, by the way, a shopping district, a waterfront entertainment hub, and diplomatic district, and so on. So almost thinking of the city as a kind of a theme park, where different kinds of functions can be housed on different islands, and they can all be connected up with these freeways and high-speed links and so on. So in all of this kind of rather um, fanciful imagination of the city, what you also see in reality that is happening is that the infrastructure projects that are being built in the city are uh, have become a crucial method for displacing the city's working poor from land areas which are of high land value. So, for instance, the Mumbai Urban Transport Project, the Mumbai Urban Infrastructure Project, this Mithi River rejuvenation, the airport expansion, Dharavi redevelopment, all of them are going to displace thousands, tens of thousands of households from the city. And in fact, in many cases, it almost seems like that is the intention of these projects, because especially if you look at these infrastructure projects, they are the way they are laid out almost seems to be that they go over slums because that's the line of least resistance. Because if you go over, let's say, a middle class colony, there'll be all kinds of litigation. There will be heavy compensations that will have to be paid. But when you go over a slum, you can simply call them encroachments anyway, and put them in rehabilitation housing, and you can build these projects. So it also creates a big industry for the for builders who are in the business of rehabilitation of the poor. So this is the kind of trends that we're seeing. And yeah, in line with these monumental reimaginations of the city is also this, where you have this big business district in island city Bombay, and then you create these other business districts, peripheral ones, which are linked by these infrastructure projects and so on, right? And this is the Surbana plan again. And in the island city, as I mentioned, real estate is the biggest business. So if real estate is the business, then urban renewal like this of Bindi Bazaar seems to be the way everybody tends to see the city benefiting. Now, the problem with this is that, I mean, even in this image is actually by the builders who are proposing this project. And you can see the connection between the two different kinds of urban form that exist here, right? There is no relationship between the inner city fabric where this monstrosity is going to come up and this monstrosity, the kind of demands that these buildings will place on the on land for private vehicles, for water, for other forms of infrastructure, for transport and so on. It's one almost thinks like thinks that planners have no conception of what this is going to mean for the city and what it is going to do, in fact, to the city. I mean, just think about the kind of carbon impacts of the embodied energy and the energy that is going to the carbon that is going to be emitted in the use of these buildings, right? And so this is the kind of stark inequalities that the city is creating, where on the one hand, this is a slum redevelopment project, by the way, where the people who live there are um, literally stacked in these pigeonhole houses, which then make room for this midtown commercial monolith. And you see this happening all over. There is no, I mean, there is not even an iota of thought given to the conditions of housing in these buildings, which are so close together that if you live in the lower floors, you don't see sunlight even for a moment during the day. And of course, then you have these other Disneyland kind of reimaginations of the waterfront, eastern waterfront of the city. This is by um, our favorite architect, Hafiz Contractor, who plans this theme park on the western waterfront. Um, and this was obviously a pitch for a proposal. Fortunately, he didn't get it, but unfortunately, the people who got it didn't have a better idea. So this is what we are going to get in the eastern waterfront if things go as they plan. So yeah, I think this is the last slide. No, sorry. Um, and obviously, nobody has any conception of what it means for the working neighborhoods of the eastern waterfront. These are places which still provide livelihoods to people who work there in the shipbreaking industry or in the other informal manufacturing units that exist there. But somehow in all of these eastern waterfront plans, there is not even a mention of the occupations and what will happen to them. On the other hand, on the eastern waterfront, you see this nice little bowl of noodles that is going to come up in the Haji Ali Dargah. It's called the Coastal Road, where going to replace this incredible biodiversity of the coastline of the rocky shore, um, and the livelihoods of the fisher folk who work there, who fish there in the intertidal areas, and will are going to lose their livelihoods and their commons as a result. Yeah, that's the end of the presentation. Any questions or comments? I will be happy to respond. Nobody? No questions? No comments? Was it helpful at all? Was it useful, or this is something that you already know? So you got bored and fell asleep?
I just feel like it was a lot of new information, so we're still processing it.
Processing. Okay. I think it doesn't have to be a question, guys. It can be also observations, it can be thoughts, it can be reflections. People who live, who are from Mumbai, people who are not from Mumbai, we would like to hear your views and experiences on some of these things that I was talking about.
The end was pretty funny. Uh, yeah, like photoshopping those huge towers onto the smaller settlements.
Hey, don't say it's Photoshop. Yeah, they made a render. And
No,
they spent a lot
the
of
red.
time and labor on making those ridiculous renders. Yeah, don't undermine poor Hafiz's work. Well, that was an advertising pitch, right? It was a pitch for the project. I mean, so you can imagine what really is selling.
Yeah, but we are meant to make photo montages. Like how we imagine the place for coexistence. But this was
Hmm.
like this was एकदम अलग ही type का था.
Mhm.
But who imagines it like ऐसा अचानक से इतना लंबा लंबा टावर और सब एकदम नीचे नीचे.
No, I mean, in a way, it is coexistence. It's a coexistence of these monoliths with the Ferris wheel and and these neon lights, and I mean, it's a kind of a Disneyland way of thinking about the city. The city is basically, look, it's. I mean, we can make fun of it, obviously, and one should make fun of it because it is ridiculous. But the point is that it is not the problem is not that this imagination is silly, right? The problem is that this is a way of it's a way of thinking about the city as a site not for people to live in or work in, but a site for investors to invest in. Hmm? It's a city which is imagined for investors, not for people. Okay, not for people at least who are going to live in it. Like all of these high end residential towers that are going to come up, whether through the redevelopment of the BDD Chawls or the Bindi Bazaar project, or in the case of the eastern waterfront, they are not going to be lived by people. Mostly these are going to be houses that are going to be bought by investors. They are projects that cater to investors who buy these as a form of investment, not as a place for living in. And then what happens? So then you get the situation where if the city has, huge housing poverty for more than half of the population, But on the other hand, you have lakhs and lakhs, almost 4.5 lakh vacant houses. Now, in any sane and rational world, one would think that there is, this is completely poor, ill allocation of resources, right? Um, but that's not how apparently the city's planners think about it. So that is really the problem. So people like Hafiz should not be dismissed lightly. No, I mean, forget Hafiz. That was anyway, that image was striking. So we put it in the presentation. But just think about the current Eastern Waterfront Master Plan. Okay, that is made by Bimal Patel and his firm. Now, I mean, I don't want to go into the entire body of practice of Bimal Patel and all the work that he's doing all over the country, but you can see, I mean, if you just go to the MBPT website and download the plan and just read the preamble of that plan. It's very clear what the objectives are. The objective is not to, create better homes for people who live there, or better workplaces for people who work there, or think about the employment needs of the people who have lost their employment because the docks have, mainly the port operations have moved to the mainland. Nothing of that. The discussion is about, what is the land value here, what kind of FSI should we give for this kind of land on the waterfront, and how many government offices can be built, and how many commercial units can come in here, and what will be the kind of investments that will come in, and and then some silly kind of reclaimed park thrown in just for making the environmentalists feel that we care about open spaces and so on. So it's a really atrocious proposal, and one must look at it and think about why it is happening. Not really just to say that, oh, if I had it, I would do it better, but to think about why is it that these kinds of plans are made, and why is it that they're not contested more than they are already being contested, right? Those are important questions for us to ask. Yeah. Anybody else?
uh, how much would be what would be in our control to actually influence us decisions?
Look, um, there are two or three things here. We all play various roles in our city and in our society, right? You are all going to be architects and professionals and practitioners. Hmm? You're also citizens of the city. You're citizens of the country. You can so you have various, you can act in various capacities. Nobody has to be in, hired as a planner in the government to be able to do something or influence these things. Hmm? There are various ways in which people can do various things, and people already do that. You can write about it, you can research about it, you can lobby about it, you can make counter propositions, you can do agitations, you can activate your professional community to make petition against it. You can do all kinds of things. You must probably have know a little bit about the opposition to Central Vista. you know a lot of architects all over the country have actually, for I would say for the very first time, so many architects have spoken, or speaking in a united voice against the project. Now that's a first. It's not enough and it's not very well organized, but still it's something, right? So there's no reason why architects in Bombay can't do that. But if you look at try to find voices in the city, amongst the professional community, against or about, forget against, even about an opinion about what is going on in the Eastern Waterfront, you'll rarely find anything. Yeah, which also shows that there is um, the the commercial opportunism of the professionals prevents them from taking any strong stands or any stand against or about anything that is going on around them, you know, which is actually concerning quite a bit. Yeah. I mean, just think about it. The Eastern Waterfront is actually a more serious um, issue as compared to the Milllands issue. First of all, it's a much larger area, right? The Milllands was a smaller land parcel, all put together, but there was a lot of contestation about the Milllands. There's comparatively nothing with respect to the Eastern Waterfront, and one has to. I mean, it's really a good historical question. Why is it that during the Milllands there was so much opposition? Well, I mean, not all the opposition was very good, but still there was something. There were middle class groups talking about open spaces, and there were workers unions wanting to have a different way of opening up those lands, and there were citizens who were saying other things. But comparatively, if you look at the Eastern Waterfront, there is absolutely nothing. And why is that? In 20 years, that kind of public engagement is not there in an important piece of geography of the city. Okay, one last question and then we'll close. Question, comment, reflections, anything is fine.
Yeah, if you see it like that, like I have this building and I can see from my window most of the like the windows, like the rooms I can see are totally vacant. The building is fully built, but the flats are like vacant. But all of the flats are sold. So
Exactly.
people have taken it on rent, and they may give it like everybody wants to keep hogging all the flats. So it's like the mindset of the people is only such which encourages the developers to keep on building.
No, I mean, you've got the causation ulta. Look, if it's not that people have a certain mindset with due to which developers or the authorities respond in a certain way. I mean, one should be careful not to reproduce the mindset of the colonial authorities who said that, oh, Indian people live in filthy conditions, so we don't need to worry about sanitation. That's the way in which they conceived of the problem, because it because they benefited from it. They didn't have to worry about sanitation. So we should try to think, why is it that all of these houses that you're talking about, which are lying vacant, but they're sold, who can afford them? Can you afford
That,
them?
and
Can
that's
I
not
afford them?
affordable. No.
It's not affordable. The average house in Bombay is upwards of 1.5 to 2 crores. You know, just do the median income of Bombay is 20,000 rupees per month. How many people can afford it? You're talking about, say, 2 or 3% of the city's population who can afford to live in the city in its formal housing, right? Now, if that is the case, the people who are buying these houses are either that 1 or 2%, or you're talking about people who are investors outside. you know so they are not buying those houses to live in them. They're buying those houses because they have money, surplus cash stacked away, and real estate is very good business. Hmm? So that's the problem. Now, what is the city losing as a result? The city is losing valuable space. When you have scarcity of space, you want you don't want to waste it on somebody's investment. You want to make sure first that the needs of the people who live in it are addressed first, right?
It was like a previously open ground like sort of thing, and then again in 1 year a whole building comes up, but it's
Yeah.
lying vacant.
Hmm. Yeah, so somebody lost that ground, right?
The ground was actually not accessible even for the kids.
So must be somebody's private property. They must have fenced it
No,
and
but it was a
waiting for
very
the.
big one.
Okay, where is this? Which area are you
In
talking?
in Ghatkopar in the east, it's right in like It was a big space. One
Mm.
could even play there, but then it was not accessible, and then now the whole building comes up.
Mm. Okay, so should we close now? All right. So what we're going to do is the CRs, if you can do us a favor and upload on your on the Teams itself. If you can upload the class name list, what we'll do is we'll divide you all into groups and we'll assign readings to each of the groups. And so and a schedule of the readings. So from next week onwards, we'll do the presentation of all the readings. All right. So if possible, please put the name list up today itself. So by the end of the day or by tomorrow, you'll have your reading list. And I'll also upload the readings on the on Teams itself, so you can download it from there. So the readings will be available for you on this on the in the files tab. Okay. CR,
Yeah.
say something.
Yeah.
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 Okay. So then let's close and see you next week. Okay, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Until
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.